Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Overcoming Pandemic-Related Impacts in the Geosciences, Perspectives from Postdocs, which is part of our AGI webinar series. I'm Luke Charbonneau, and I'll be moderating today's webinar with Christopher Keene and Leila Gonzalez, who are also joining us from AGI. In today's webinar, we're going to be hearing from 3 different speakers via a panel discussion on pandemic-related impacts to their research. Now, the 3 panelists we have for today include Dr. Arthur Sylvester, who's a published author and professor emeritus at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Then we also have Dr. Curtis Walker, who's a project scientist at the Research Applications Laboratory at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And we have Dr. Elizabeth Libby Ives, who's a geologist with the U.S. Geologic Survey. The first question I want us to focus on is, what obstacles did you encounter during the pandemic? And I'll open the floor for whatever panelist wants to jump in and chime on this first.
Well, Luke, this is Curtis Walker. I'm happy to start us off, I guess. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Certainly great to be here with you all. And for me, transitioning, especially from a postdoc into my current position right at the start of the pandemic in 2020, some of the greatest obstacles were certainly when it came to networking and when it came to familiarity with others, both within my organization and outside of my organization. As perhaps many of you have experienced, the networking aspects of the pandemic, whether directly or at conferences and otherwise, have kind of created this awkward void where, maybe you're not aware of people in your field and people in your field are not aware of you and your work as well. So there's some of that extra effort you have to put into spinning up your research program. Fortunately, I've been able to, also take advantage of some of maybe the silver linings of the virtual world, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that in due time as well.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Arthur, Libby, what obstacles did you guys encounter during the pandemic?
Yeah, hi, this is Libby. Thanks for having me. And I think I do have to say that everything I say today is a reflection of my personal experience and not, federal government policy or anything like that. But I would echo everything Curtis just said. And I'm coming at it from a little bit of a different perspective, as I wrapped up the last couple of years of my PhD during the pandemic and then onboarded a little bit later onto the USGS. But networking is a big challenge. A lot of again, as Curtis said, a lot of the traditional avenues for that have, such as conferences especially, were limited for a time. And then also networking within an organization, because everybody is teleworking or remote working, and it's hard to be aware, again echoing everything Curtis was saying. And I would add to that some of the other obstacles I observed while in grad school and in my new position as a mapping geologist, there's been limitations on field work, which I know have been challenging for a lot of people, which have lifted more recently, but there was still a couple of years where it was hard to get work done, and the limited access to some labs while I was finishing up my dissertation research kind of redirected some of the work I had planned on doing. So that was my experience.
Yeah, perfect. And then Arthur, would you like to chime in? What obstacles did you encounter in your research during the pandemic?
Certainly. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having me too. I'm at the opposite end of the spectrum of Libby and Curtis. I retired 19 years ago, but I'm still working. And the pandemic didn't have a lot of obstacles and did put a lot of obstacles in the way of me, particularly. I published 3 books here in the last 6 years. One of them came out at the beginning of the pandemic, and so the work had already been done pretty much for that. The other one came out this last January, and the work for that was done mostly during the pandemic. And as Curtis alluded, several things that really helped, that were new and helped me in that research for the book and the publication of it were Dropbox and Zoom. And of course, I was able to correspond with anybody and everybody all over the country by Zoom or by email. It was easy to download journal articles. I could get to the library and get books I needed, but I had most of what I needed in my own library. So I really wasn't impacted very much by the pandemic itself. I had some medical issues of my own that came up that prevented me and the pandemic from getting to my office. So I've been sitting here in a recliner for most of the time, working on a laptop that gives me connection to my desktop computers in my office. So I wasn't impacted very much by it.
Perfect. Thanks for providing that context for that, Arthur. Before I move on to our next question, is there any questions in the chat for our panel on what was already said? Oh, here we go. Perfect. One question I have from Margaret is, did you find that your institutions were supportive during the pandemic? Did they help find solutions for the barriers that you encountered?
I'll lead off and say my organization was extremely supportive, um, to the point of, even for some postdocs, where maybe they had job offers rescinded or found themselves in kind of needing a gap year or funding situation, that the institution was able to come up with some funding to extend postdocs maybe beyond the normal 2-year time frame or whatever it might have been. Additionally, as we transition to the work from home environment during the early stages of the pandemic, we had regular town halls and communication with leadership. And they really emphasize, and still to this day, really emphasize being flexible and knowing that everyone was experiencing something different, whether it was with childcare, with elder care, whether you were a parent, single or otherwise, didn't have kids, really just knowing that there was no one size fits all that was going to work for everyone. And some people, had the ability to work from home easily, and others, it really was a challenge. But they really did everything in their power to keep people as comfortable as could be in their positions financially, personally, and otherwise. And that was a huge difference maker for sure.
Well, I would add that uh, the university did allow us ways to get to our offices, wearing masks and that kind of thing. But otherwise, I really didn't have much interaction with the university itself. I might add that one of the things that did happen during the pandemic is I changed directions greatly of my research and got involved out of the geological aspects of things and got into wildfire research with a eager young researcher out of the geography department. So he and I got out in the field a fair amount of time because we could get out there, be alone, and both of us were vaccinated. So we had a grand time getting out in the field.
Yeah. No, perfect. And then a follow-up question I also see in the chat related to what you two just discussed is, did your institutions implement any like specific policy changes to support postdocs during the pandemic? Like, were there any like distinct changes you recall?
I'm not aware of any.
I'll say no specific policy changes at NCAR, but as I mentioned, maybe more of an ad hoc basis, extensions given, and some of those have certainly stuck around, and so maybe they will be formally codified in policy going forward.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. All right. I'm going to move on to the next focus question. If anybody has any additional questions, feel free to keep adding them to the chat and we'll answer them as they come up. The next topic I want to focus on, and Curtis already kind of alluded to, like, silver linings and other ways of getting around things. The next thing we want to shift our focus to is what strategies did you implement to address the challenges you faced during the pandemic, or what new modes or tactics did you see yourself doing during the pandemic that you didn't do prior to the pandemic? And I'll open this up for whichever panelist wants to start.
All right, yeah, we'll keep this order going, I guess. And so, as I started to say in the previous answer, really taking advantage of the virtual networking opportunities was a strategy that I implemented to address those networking challenges. And so, case in point, my research is at the intersection of weather, climate, but also civil engineering and surface transportation. And so, typically, I would often have to decide whether I traveled to an atmospheric science conference or more of an engineering type of conference, given limited travel funding for airfare, hotel, and all that good stuff. However, with the transition to hybrid or fully virtual meetings, that's allowed me to really stretch my travel budget to attend some meetings and connect with some colleagues virtually that I might not have the opportunity to otherwise, where it was a lot easier to just pay a registration fee than hop on a plane, have a hotel, and per diem for 3 or 4 nights in a different city, anywhere in the world for that matter. And that's been the other asset is certainly the switch to virtual and hybrid has really allowed not only for domestic here in the United States, but also for broader connections internationally as well, with colleagues that I probably wouldn't see, but once every 4 or 5 years if I was lucky, prior to the pandemic. So certainly a silver lining there.
Yeah, I would once again echo everything Curtis just said. The virtual conferences, and additionally, I've seen professional societies setting up regular webinar series or, informal virtual get-togethers. All of those sorts of things have just been enormously helpful in terms of networking and being able to being able to share and hear about work that you may not have otherwise, even at those um, larger conferences. I've also been leaning a little more heavily than I think I would normally on social media to get out, such as ResearchGate and LinkedIn and Twitter, to if I have a publication or a talk coming up or something, I've just been trying to use that as much as possible to let people know I exist and I'm doing work, and because other people's opportunities to attend conferences and things are also limited and challenging.
Yeah, like Libby, I used social media somewhat to announce the publication of our books because it's been said that if you're not publishing, people think you're dead. So you have to um, really to get it out there. You have to use every opportunity you can. Um, I I think I'll stop there because I think everybody said what I would have said anyway. Go ahead.
Perfect. Any other questions for our panelists here? Here we go. Um, a question we have in the chat is what strategy do you feel like was the most helpful, like kind of like your biggest takeaway? What strategy was something that you've tried that you saw that was really helpful to you during the pandemic, and at what points were they useful at different points of the pandemic? Is a question I have in the chat.
I'll butt in here and say that as being retired, I could just sit at home here and focus fully on writing the book. I didn't have um, meetings to attend either virtually or in person. I didn't have students coming in, and I didn't feel as though I didn't have some classes I had to somehow teach. So Zoom really helped a lot when I wanted to get in touch with people or email. And I think just all the virtual parts were really implemented to the fullest by me.
Hmm.
I think for me, the most useful strategy, or the thing that's really stuck with me and helped me get, stay motivated through the pandemic, have been these informal virtual gathering
Hmm.
sort of spaces. And just, and these are where I've seen them, they're typically, or where I've participated in them, they're a group of peers where you're able to talk about both work and, common life stages. So for postdocs or early career people, that a lot of that has to do with moving and relocating and those sorts of challenges. But, these conversations that would normally happen in the office or amongst colleagues that tend not to happen organically when you're working from home, or people are teleworking a lot as frequently. The professional conferences and things have been really nice, but the sort of communities that I've most valued during this time have been those informal sort of set regular meetings.
And I'll just briefly add and echo, what both Arthur and Libby contributed. And the only other thing I'll add is, for a helpful strategy I found is, really still trying to connect and meet people where they were at, and understand that, um, especially early in the pandemic, some people were maybe adjusting to the new normal very well, and for others it was a struggle. And I think really just leading any kind of email or correspondence off with empathy, and as Libby said, even informal meetings, still trying to recreate that, 5 or 10 minutes either at the beginning of a meeting or end of a meeting, of kind of just check in and banter, that you'd have in person, so that you did have that a little bit of that sense of normalcy.
That's a good point. I used Zoom and email to connect with people I hadn't really connected to for quite a while, just to see how they're doing and find out what they're doing lately in research. And it was really good to do that way. And people all over the country, I could do that.
Yeah, no, perfect. Thanks for answering the questions, guys. And kind of the latter part of that question, were there strategies that were useful at different points? That's going to kind of segue right into our next focus question here. The next topic we're interested in, speaking of changes, is these new pandemic related strategies that you guys have developed in response to the pandemic. Because obviously, the pandemic hit, everybody had to kind of adapt, sink or swim, had to figure out, at least to some extent, some changes that were happening in their life. Do you feel like these new strategies that you've implemented, are they something that's ephemeral and temporary, or are they something that you see to remain in play for the foreseeable future and maybe evolve or change over time in your field? So I know this is kind of a big question, so you can kind of tackle it however you want, but I guess the first part is, for our panel, is what strategies do you feel like are temporary versus like a permanent new way of something you're going to use all the time in the future?
Well, certainly, to lead off there, I think many of these changes are permanent in some capacity. Maybe the frequency might change. For example, I have an upcoming seminar at a university, where I'll actually fly out there. So this will be my first time on a plane in 2.5 years, for business travel. So looking forward to that, but also like, wait, I've forgotten, out of practice on this. But I think in terms of the virtual environment being a powerful tool, whether it's social media, Zoom, or what have you, I think that's here to stay, because it really opens up some new opportunities for not only collaboration, but also in terms of conversations around things like equity and access to science for a variety of audiences. I think those are very powerful tools. Specific to what I've shared in terms of the networking components as well, I think many meetings are going to take this hybrid approach going forward, and that might be the new challenge: is how do you integrate the in-person and virtual components together now? It's been kind of funny because my experience at NCAR has been that we'll schedule a hybrid meeting, and then still half to majority of the people end up being online, even if they're from their offices. And part of that's just a convenience factor, or a comfort factor. And so I think some of those maybe pandemic habits too are not going to go away quickly, if at all. And that's not a bad thing, just a new thing for us to adjust to.
Yeah, I like this question, because it kind of hits the it's not something we can have an answer to. And like Curtis said, I think it's gonna depend and change and morph. And we had this whole new way of doing things that we got really good at, but we missed the in-person way of doing things. And I think our challenge going forward is going to be figuring out what can and should be done virtually and what can and should be done in person, and and figuring out how to make the hybrid thing happen. For example, I went to a small meeting, like first meeting in that I went to in person this past spring, and there was supposed to be a hybrid component, but one person signed up, and so they decided not to do that, and things of that nature. But yeah, it's going to evolve, it's going to change, and I think we're all going to be learning together, just like we learned together how to be fully virtual.
Yeah, ditto for everything that Curtis and Libby has said. I would just observe that think where we were 25 years ago and think where we'll be 25 years from now. And what's going on now is going to contribute to what's going to happen over the next 25 years. It's pretty hard to see how we're going to make the virtual and the in-person work. I've been involved in another organization that is successfully, very successfully, been holding hybrid meetings, mainly because people are not comfortable going to personal meetings, but also they live just far enough away that they don't wish to drive that far just for an hour-long meeting. So I think that some of this is here to say, like Curtis and Libby have said.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. I saw that echoing that you were all mentioning of there's like this like balance between how much virtual versus like in person we should have, and like what the demand for that is. Like, like what Libby mentioned, if only one person signs up for a hybrid thing, they're not going to keep supporting that hybrid thing. So it's just interesting to hear that some components are definitely going to stay throughout, and it's going to just evolve as everything evolves. So I like that.
Yeah,
Perfect.
just one more point I just thought of, or one more example I just thought of where this is a challenge, is onboarding new employees in an organization. And so I know there's a push and pull I've seen between wanting to attract a wider pool of candidates by having virtual or remote opportunities for entry-level employees, but at the same time, everybody has seen how challenging like onboarding and supervising early, incoming and early employees is virtually. And I'm really interested to see where that one goes, or how we resolve those challenges too, because I think in the end you do want that. I would think you would want that broader pool of applicants, but it is an ongoing challenge to figure out how that works.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. A question I have in the chat for the panel is, where do you see the virtual platforms being the most useful in work and research versus in-person modalities? Like where do you see the virtual kind of taking over versus the in-person components being more useful than the virtual?
I think Arthur kind of hit the nail on the head from what I've seen, where I think the people seem to find the most value in like a multi-day thing being in person, so that you're actively going there and actively engaging. Because I've experienced this, and I've heard from some people that attending multi-day events virtually is challenging because you feel like you should be engaging in your normal activities as well as attending the event. But with shorter meetings and shorter events that would require a lot of travel to be in person, like an hour-long meeting, I think those are going to be virtual for a long time. And that's kind of where I'm not going to try to predict the future or anything, but those are the trends I've seen, I guess.
Maybe I'll just add the component that I think a huge area that could remain in person is, now that I've transitioned from the postdoc to the project scientist role, we're mostly project or soft money funded. And so in that capacity, I think a lot of initial engagement with sponsors will be highly variable. I think some sponsors, um, like private and tech firms that they themselves have embraced a virtual environment, those conversations might remain using those virtual platforms. But I think there's another group of sponsors that really like that initial in-person engagement, and it helps us as scientists to really understand what are their operations, what are their needs, and where's the research and development opportunities for us to collaborate together. Some of those are much easier to see in person than via, say, a Zoom call or something. So I could see that sponsor and project funding space being highly variable going forward.
Yeah, and in the chat, I'm seeing a comment that somebody wrote that in research, Zoom has improved international and inter-university collaboration. So it seems like a lot of like the communication, as you guys have mentioned, is really opened up for people that just talk that would not normally talk because they have that outlet. Cool. Again, any other questions, you can pop them in the chat. We're gonna shift over to our next focus question. Oh, here we go. One more question we have is, how has work in your environment changed to be more flexible remote and in-person work, or is it transitioned more to in-person work? So I guess the question here is asking, in light of the pandemic, are you working from home? Are you hybrid? Are people shifting everything back to the way it was before, to the new status quo in the endemic phase? What's all of your current work situations?
Happy to lead off and say, so you can see I'm at home currently behind me, but I've shifted to a hybrid work environment. I try to go into the office about 3 days a week, and that's just I like my desk. I have more space to work there. Officially, though, our organization policy is we've fully embraced a either a hybrid, an in-person, or a completely remote environment. And so I have colleagues that have moved out of state and no longer come into the office and completely work from home now. So as I mentioned at the beginning, NCAR has really been flexible to know and to try to account for everyone's unique situation and let people work in whatever environment is most conducive to their success.
And my personal situation is I've finished my PhD remotely from home, away from the university, and I was able to initially onboard with the USGS working remotely because at the time the Department of Interior had a pretty much blanket work from home policy. But as the federal government has transitioned back to the office, they've been very flexible with telework, and they are starting to become more, which is where you can work from home, but you come into the office so many days a week or a pay period. And they've introduced policies to become more flexible with remote work, which is where you don't have to come into a specific office at all. But I'm currently in the process of moving to the DC area because of they still are valuing highly that in-person component when people can be in the office.
I might say that I'm president of another organization that has been holding hybrid meetings, mostly because it's an elderly group that wants to maintain a sense of comfort. It's a group that's 600 people strong, and we do have in-person meetings where we put on what's called an owl in the middle of the room that can go out and be transmit hybrid to all the people who want to get in on this. I see our group wanting more and more to interact personally as the COVID dies down here. People really want to get together and see each other, and they're getting a little tired of these Zoom meetings.
Yeah, no, that all makes sense. Let's transition to our fourth focus question now. Thanks for hanging in there, everybody. This next question focuses on what new opportunities, if any, became available to you during the pandemic that you probably weren't aware of before the pandemic maybe highlighted for you. And you can kind of think of this in relation to what we talked about earlier. If the pandemic forced your hand or you were required to make all these adaptations and changes, what were some of the new things you did that you didn't expect yourself to do, or something you kind of saw as like a learning experience, something new you could do that you couldn't do before?
Yeah, certainly to, just to recap maybe what's been said before, I think the flexible work arrangements, that has been a huge asset. During the pandemic, my second daughter was born in December 2020. So I guess a pandemic baby, not quite. But anyway, with that said, certainly some of those childcare issues that have persisted thereafter, have been beneficial. And I think just this overall nature of flexibility, NCAR's always been a pretty work-life balance friendly place, but it became even more so during the pandemic. And when kids got COVID and things like that, it was certainly, just a breath of fresh air to know that, there wasn't maybe the work pressure that was on you, and supervisors and everyone else really understood. So I think just that changed atmosphere certainly has been great. And then the other piece, just the opportunity to engage with folks more broadly, and reach them in a research collaboration space that I might not have prior to the pandemic, has certainly been an opportunity that was a maybe it would have happened without COVID, but certainly accelerated as a result of it.
Yeah, I honestly don't have anything to add to the what Curtis just said. Telework, a culture of a little bit more flexibility in the workplace and collaborations that may not have existed before. Those are all huge things that have evolved out of this.
I think I would have to say that a lot of my opportunities were shortcut. I see my colleagues at the university much less than I would have otherwise. Some of them I haven't seen and talked to for a couple of years. Whereas on the other hand, I've been going out on my own and with a couple of other people into new areas of research. And I think these new opportunities for me are these opportunities to go into this new research with just a few other people and be introduced to a whole new set of literature that I can read by myself online. And I've been going to some few small meetings with new people in this new line of research. So as I say, I'm retired, but I'm still working. I'm having a good time going into new and different things.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And something I'm curious to ask you, Arthur, is I know talking to other people during the pandemic when everything shifted to online and people, people who are doing like thin section work or very hands-on field work, their research was heavily disrupted because, they couldn't go into the lab, they didn't have access to the materials they needed to do the work, versus people who were doing like a lot of lit review, a lot of stuff with like GIS or Python coding, people who were doing very computational stuff or stuff that just required internet access. They had plenty of time to do their work and maybe get access to more of it, because at least some of the people I talked to said like the amount of PDFs and things uploaded online went up, and there was actually more literature available because people were making this transition to put it online because people couldn't go into the office or into the library to get it. So did you notice, Arthur, in your research, were you finding good resources online? Were there a lot of things that were PDFs that were easily accessible for you?
Oh, yes, there was no problem with that at all. I think I would say I was seeing much more literature online like that than I would have if I were sitting in my office. Um, and yeah, I was, and the people that I was working with on this book, they were firing PDFs to me every other day about new things that I would not have come across.
Yeah, no, perfect. That makes sense. And then the other thing I've just noticed in research is that a lot of people tell me they did kind of a shift to like take more classes for like GIS or learn how to code or learn how to use more of those online resources because they realize those are kind of here to stay. So I don't know. I know I'm trying to remember from our talks. I don't know if Curtis and Libby, did you guys take any like online courses to kind of like enhance your skills, kind of seeing what the new trends are given the context?
Yeah, I did. I ended up enrolling during the pandemic in UC Boulder's, oh gosh, Earth Data Analytics. I think it's like graduate certificate program. And I'm not sure if I would have done that outside the pandemic because that decision was really driven by my scene. I think that cycle, there were just a lot of job postings and continue to be a lot of job postings for postdocs and faculty positions that really center and value the, those sorts of skill sets, the GIS, the remote sensing, the processing large data sets. So yeah, I'm not sure if that was a pandemic. I think I had fewer things going on maybe that made it possible for me to take on that coursework, with not to the detriment of finishing my dissertation.
Yeah.
And I'll just briefly add, I certainly took a lot of online learning type things, LinkedIn and other sources as well. And just, yeah, kind of maybe that work from home gave a little bit more extra time, right? That half hour or hour commute was gone. So that was a chance to do a little bit more skill development.
Yeah, no, perfect. Thank you. I was just remember what I had talked to you guys about before, so I thought that was a good thing to add in here. Next, we have a couple more focus questions left, and again, keep the questions flowing if you have them. Our panelists would be happy to answer them. This is kind of a more reflective question. I mean, hindsight is 2020. No pun intended, but we can focus on this. What's a piece of advice you would give someone, either like yourself or somebody in a similar situation, who's entering your same field of research given the current climate and conditions?
Lead off and say networking has maybe taken on an even greater significance, and really surrounding yourself by advisors, mentors, and allies that can advocate on your behalf. Because of the virtual environment, your network has become more important. And so you might not be able to get the FaceTime with some of the folks in the field that might fund your work in the future or offer you job opportunities. But the hope is that someone in your network can perhaps connect you and really, really give you that opportunity to make those connections that you yourself, it might be a layer removed now. So I think networking is always important, and I think it's even more important now, more than ever.
I would once again second everything Curtis has said, and don't have anything to add really. Yeah, and it's except that maybe leveraging your current network, but I feel like to a certain extent, because people are meeting more often virtually or reaching out to and connecting with a sort of a broader network that they may not have had prior to the pandemic. Sorry, I forget where I was going. It seems like people, at least from, maybe this is just because I'm early career new on the scene, but I feel like more people have been sort of blind contacting other people in their field that you may have expected at one point to run into at a conference, but now those opportunities are not there. So
Yeah, about the networking part here, I am in a position where I'm seeing jobs come up or opportunities come up, and I can turn around and reach out to former students or people I know and say, hey, have you seen this? Do you know about this? Um, People that are in research that are sort of in my line or even not even related to my line, I can say, hey, did you see this paper? Here's a PDF of it. You really ought to have a look at this. Um, I think that giving the advice, people are going to have to network, and they're going to have to find creative ways to do this more than just waiting for somebody to tap on the shoulder.
Yeah, and that's interesting that you guys all brought up the networking and how there's this networking is important, and there's this like kind of again another transition between like how much of it should be like virtual versus like in person. And I guess to kind of spin that question, do you see most of the networking you guys are doing, is it mostly virtual where you're like outreaching to people you wouldn't have reached out to before and you're contacting people online, or are you still getting most of your opportunities and new things from the times where you're in person seeing people face to face? What do you kind of notice is the balance between that?
Well, none of my networking has been face to face during the pandemic.
Mm.
It's been all virtual.
Yeah, my experience is that because face-to-face time is more limited, that if there's been more reaching out prior, or again, maybe this is just because I'm new, or recently graduated and haven't been around that long, but it seems like there's more intentional reaching out to not to, before in-person events just to make sure you get that time, um, which I'm sure is something that happened before, but it seems to be a little more urgent or a little more pointed, maybe.
I'll just say with external folks in the network, I'd say it's happening more mostly virtually. Internally, though, say people that work at NCAR that maybe I just haven't bumped into previously, maybe half and half, some in-person opportunities, and there is that push among some to have more, hey, let's do lunch, let's grab coffee. And then some of it's also happening virtually as well. But there's maybe internally a bit more of a mix.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense.
One of the things I have done during the pandemic is been giving public lectures to local societies and community groups, and I try to do it in such a way that I involve the people in those meetings. And so the advice I would give is people to enter in this field, get on those meetings of, say, the local geological society, or um, I think that some of the big meetings, AEPG or SSA, they're holding virtual meetings and don't cost much. Get in on those and uh, chime in on the chat and let people know who you are and what you're interested in.
Yeah, no, perfect. That makes complete sense. Thank you, Arthur. Our next question. Okay, so considering your pandemic experiences, what's your biggest takeaway for how to effectively navigate future obstacles and setbacks to maintain continuity in your work and research in the future? I guess to paraphrase this in a simpler way, like, God forbid there's another pandemic in the future, or there's some other huge obstacle that disrupts your whole working environment again. What did you kind of learn from your pandemic experiences for how you kind of handle those obstacles and navigate around them?
Actually willing to go last for this one. I don't want to take Libby and Arthur's thunder again, so
Yeah.
I'll go last.
um, I was I was hoping I'd get like another minute to think about this because I know you sent us the question beforehand, but I wasn't able to
Yeah.
thoroughly put good words on this one. But I guess I think one of my biggest takeaways for research, specifically and career trajectory, is to be flexible and keep your options open. Has kind of been my feel, just the general uncertainty of the last, oh god, 2.5 years, or and and I guess specifically in terms of research, just cultivating different ideas that take advantage of different skill sets, and always have something in your back pocket to pivot to that would be interesting in case your access to something changes. Yeah.
I think that one of my takeaways on this is, as Libby has said, you got to be flexible in this. You may end up having to work independently, and everybody complains they don't have enough time to write. The pandemic certainly made time for me to write, and this could be one of the most productive times in your career, is to take advantage of the time that social distancing forces on you, and make use of the time. Just don't stop what you're doing. Kind of keep trying to push forward.
And I will echo Libby and Arthur and maybe sum it up and say, flexibility and versatility in all that you do, being flexible, um, resilient, to the extent possible, kind of roll with things as they come at you. And that's a great skill, not just for, heaven forbid, a future pandemic, but also for other obstacles and challenges and setbacks that come in your research or in your personal and professional life as well. And certainly it's been a trial by fire and a master class perhaps for some, but definitely lifelong skills learned nonetheless.
Here, here.
Yeah, no, perfect. And then I'm seeing a question we have in the chat is, do you think your work environment is more resilient to disaster disruption shocks than it was pre-pandemic? And if so, how?
That's a
Yeah, I
good
definitely think.
question. Oh, go ahead. Sorry. You're back at the
Yeah, no,
beginning.
I agree. It is a great question. I think we've always maybe dealt with a certain amount of shocks. Our funding portfolios are intrinsically tied to things like government shutdowns and being soft money funded. Whether or not projects come in or don't come in, there was some of that. But I certainly think the pandemic and some of those structures put in place afterward have definitely made us more resilient, perhaps more agile as well, to the needs of the staff and the organization as a whole.
Yeah, I would agree, and as long as the disaster looks or the disruption looks similar to it has, I guess I'd be interested if something anyway. But what I really do hope sticks around is this sort of cultural shift I think we've seen that Curtis was kind of hinting at, that people are more understanding, I think, and flexible with one another, and especially in terms of um, family events and personal needs. And I just hope we remain understanding of one another and giving each other the space we need to not just be effective scientists, but also, good people and good family members and things like that. And I think we are seeing that. I just hope it's something that sticks.
I can agree with what Libby just said too. I think that it does open up more opportunities in some ways, and also too, when you have to shut down your activities, it gives you a chance to step back and do some thinking, and thinking where are you going and what is your research doing, and who cares? I had a time in my research career where I looked at what I was doing and I said, who really cares about this? And I shifted gears and went into a field that really people do care about. And the pandemic can give you some really good thinking time. And as I said before, writing time.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. I've heard a lot of people who are doing research, they noticed that they had more time for some things and other time for other things. They had to learn how to, mitigate their time a little differently. I guess, and I think it's interesting that thing you mentioned, Arthur, about how, change sometimes forces people to take a step back and reevaluate where they're at and maybe shift their focus in research. Because I know I've talked to individuals who are doing one thing, then the pandemic made them do something else, and that's the route they ended up taking. What do you feel like the pandemic shaped kind of your books and your publications? Like, do you feel like you published more because of the pandemic and you had that time to write?
I was going to say no to everything until you said time to write. The books that I've written are based on about the last 30, 40 years of experiences, and I was able to write a lot of it out of my hip pocket, but checking the latest literature to bring things up to date. So I don't think the pandemic did a darn thing to the book writing that I was doing. We were just anxious to get these books out.
And then I'll open up that kind of last topic too for Libby and Curtis as well. Do you feel like the pandemic shifted any of your research at all? Like it changed like the scope or the focus of it, or what your higher ups were asking you to do? Or do you feel like now that that's come back to normal, to stabilize what it was before?
I think one thing it did was now any grant proposal or project I do, there's always the question of, so what's the COVID caveat, or what's the pandemic caveat that you put in your research? And so if you're going to propose an analysis, in the case of some of my work where you look at traffic data for the last 5 years, well, traffic data in the last 2.5 years is nowhere near what it was like pre-pandemic. And so there's always that shift. Or similarly, if you say you're going to do focus groups, or you're going to have an in-person conference as part of your work, there's always that question of, and what do you do if you have to switch it to virtual all of a sudden, or you won't get that in-person time you're expecting. So it hasn't shifted the focus, but it certainly has underscored the need for all kinds of contingencies in the work that I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to this, mostly because the work I've been doing has been with data, field data that was collected prior to COVID. So the only thing I could speak to maybe is, that is perhaps intangible, is what the ultimate manuscript or interpretations would have looked like in a different universe where we didn't have COVID. And I would like, I don't know, I would be like, I know Arthur's been talking a lot about having time to write, and I think it's just worth mentioning, since this is a public forum, that I feel like I've seen a lot of statements and research that say not everybody experienced that time in the same way, and especially people with kids, and I know I don't have kids, or I don't have kids, but I know that people who do have especially been challenged during this time, and maybe that freedom to write isn't available to everyone.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It was the time was a different amount of time, and use of that time depending on what your other responsibilities were. That makes complete sense. We have a little under 4 minutes left, so what I want to do is I want to give time for any discussion questions, any last minute questions people want to ask our panel before we wrap up. So if you guys have any questions on anything you'd like to ask our panelists, go ahead and type them in the chat now. Oh, good. I have one comment here. Some institutions have benefited from couples who might not have had the opportunity to work in different states. For example, a husband might get a job in Texas, and because his wife works online and has a job in New York, it becomes a possibility. Okay, yeah, that's a good example.
Well, one of us has to thank you, Luke, for pulling this all together and giving us the opportunity to vent our ideas and thoughts. So I appreciate it, and hope this something good comes of it through AGI.
Yeah, that's why we're doing the research on it, so we can see the extents and consequences, or what's learned from how the COVID impacted the geoscience community. So again, if there's no last minute questions, we'll wrap up here. That's all we have time for today. If you have any questions that are not addressed to us, you can email us at webinars@americangeosciences.org, and we'll make sure to send the questions along to our speakers. And I already see that Curtis put his information in the chat if you need that. I want to thank again Dr. Arthur Sylvester, Dr. Curtis Walker, and Dr. Elizabeth Ives for sharing their time, expertise, and insight with us. Thank you for everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time.